All right. Good evening, all. I'm going to ask if people could be so kind to please mute yourselves. It's easier for everyone. Okay, good evening. This is a series that we are Chas Hashem beginning tonight that's going to take us through the season until from now until Yom Kippur. I am flattered to see there are a number of people on the call whose spouses were at the Shabbos version yesterday. So I assume that if people came home and told their wives that it was worth tuning in to tonight's rerun, that we're doing something decently. So I appreciate everybody's present, but certainly those who may have heard positive things already. The impetus for this class really had to do with trying to think about the role of metaphor in the entire season of the Yom Noraim. And it really began with a class that my wife gave a few weeks ago on Ki Anu Amecha. So Ki Anu Amecha is really one of those beautiful, at least for me, and powerful elements of the liturgy on Yom Kippur, that before we launch into the vidui, into the extended confessional, we begin by talking about our relationship with God. And it really is a litany of different models of relationship, right? So he talks about the idea of nation and God, right? Of subjects and kings, husbands and wives, parents and children, right? Vineyards and the vineyard keeper, sheep and shepherds, right? It goes through, and we sing it with really a beautiful, heartfelt kind of tune. And I always want to kind of just step on the brakes, to be able to spend like a couple of minutes at least thinking as we're going through so quickly these models, right, to think about them, right? Because I think the idea is these metaphors are very important for a number of reasons. Number one, that when we talk about God, right, and when we talk about our relationship with God, that what we are really doing is dealing in abstractions, right? The idea that this concept that we have, right, of this transcendent God that fills the universe and surrounds the universe, as the Kabbalists would have it. How do you wrap your head around that? The idea that I'm going to have a conversation about my failures, about my anxieties, about my wishes and hopes and dreams, right, with God, right? I need something to hold on to, right, to help me think about what I'm doing, right? And the idea, so that's the idea that in order to concretize, right, something which is very abstract, right, that I need, I need images, I need words, I need dynamics, and I need experiences, right? I need to be able to root it in perhaps my own, whether it be my lived experience, an idea that I have, whether it be through life or through literature, whatever it is, right, that I can conceptualize that. Then I can begin to build on that, right? That's something meaningful, right? So metaphor is there, right, to bridge the gap. Number two, and I think this is actually critically important, metaphor is particularly important, and having a what I would call a palette of metaphors is important, because not all metaphors are going to work equally well for the same person, right? So some of these, again, I'll give you an example. The image, right, of Melech and Am, right? The idea of God as a king. So I would posit that is, for most of us, right, a much less accessible kind of model, right? We don't have kings, right? Most of us, we've never lived in a monarchy. Not only have we never lived in a monarchy, right? We live in a society, right, where, we live in a country that was founded on revolution against monarchs, right? So the idea of being able to say, even though, again, it's such a time-honored image, right, that in davening, and particularly davening Rosh Hashanah, that we're omed lifnei HaMelech, that we stand before the king. So I wonder, right, if that's something that we can really relate to, right? And I'm curious. I wonder if you went to England, I wonder if it resonates differently, right? If you grew up in a society where the notion, again, it's been the Queen now for a very long time, right? But certainly the idea of royalty, right, and what royalty means, right, and what I think is completely different. But all these other models, right, and there's the parent-child dynamic, right, God as father, right? So that's something, again, very powerful, right? Very meaningful. But let's say, somebody who, grew up without a father, right? Are they able to relate to that? Or God forbid, someone with a dysfunctional relationship with a parent, right? Or an abusive relationship with a parent, right? Could that be something that is counterproductive for that person? And I would even submit that even within our own life, right, sometimes different metaphors work differently for us at different seasons of life than they would for others, right? So the idea that we need to be conversant with, again, a full palette of metaphors, I think is very, very significant. And I think the same, that all of these things that we said about Kiana Hamech, about God, right, I think is true when it comes to the notion of hate, to the notion of sin, right, and to the notion of our relationship to sin and our attempts at tshuva. Right? So tshuva is one of these also, in many ways, a very abstract kind of experience. And the question of, are there other experiences, right? Other things that we are familiar with in life, in literature, and so forth, right? That if we try to embrace, understand hate through that prism, right, that we can, find the metaphor that's going to work for us this year to make this process all the more accessible. And again, in my mind, it's just my own image. We have this tradition of the choshen of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest's breastplate, right? So during the time of the first temple, the Kohen Gadol had this kind of prophetic experience that he could look at the stones on his breastplate, right? And divine messages would emerge, right? Letters would illuminate themselves on the stones of the Kohen Gadol's breastplate. So to me, right, when we look at these metaphors, right, it's the same thing, right? What's going to suddenly start glowing for us? Right? This is the one that we need this year, right? Each of us in our own particular and unique way that is going to bring out this process of tshuva, right, in a way that's real and meaningful and powerful, and so forth. And so I initiate you into the perhaps oddly named Sin series. This is not to be confused with what will begin tomorrow morning of the Simcha series, which hopefully will be much more upbeat as well. But I think the two in tandem hopefully will be a worthwhile entryway into the season. So what I want to talk about this evening is sin as enemy. Right, the notion of sin as an enemy that needs to be fought, right? And we're going to talk about, just as a preview for the future, we're going to talk about sin as disease. We're going to talk about sin as a type of madness or foolishness. And we're going to talk about sin as a kind of sleep, right? And then again, we're not talking tonight necessarily about individual sins. We're talking about the underlying here maybe we're even going into next week already, but the malaise in our relationship with God. So the notion that sin is our enemy, right, that we are at war with sin, is a very ancient one. It's interesting. Through a calendrical coincidence, much of the Torah readings that we encounter during the month of Elul, right, are where the Torah expounds dinei milchama, the laws of warfare, right? And it's what a Jewish war is supposed to look like. So we have a very old tradition to understand this in a homiletical vein, right? To say that it's not just, or only, maybe only is a better way of putting it, it's not only about the Jewish army taking the field against the flesh and blood enemy, right? But the idea that there is another dimension to this, that we are being mustered to battle during the season of war against the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. So one of the classic works of Jewish philosophy and ethics from the Middle Ages, the Chovos Halevavos, develops this in great detail. And I'll read you just a little bit. The Chovos Halevavos writes in the 5th section, he said, you should know the great arch enemy you have in this world is your own Yetzer, right? It's your own evil inclination. He is interwoven in the forces of your soul. He rules over the secrets of your soul, what's hidden inside you. He is your advisor in all your movements. He lies in wait, watching your steps to lead you astray. You are asleep to him, but he is awake to you. You look away from him, but he does not look away from you. He masks himself as your friend and pretends to show love. Right? So that's pretty strong language, right? This notion that sin is there lurking all the time. And the truth is, it actually goes back, I think, in Tanakh, to the very, very beginning, right? So if you look in, I just want to see what my top one. If you take a look in one of the first stories of sin in the Torah, the story of Cain and Hevel, you might remember that before Cain kills Abel, God warns him, right? That there's flashing danger signs, right? He says, "La petach chatas roves," right? That sin crouches at the doorway, right? And again, that notion, you almost here's almost like a like a beast, some kind of like a big cat or something that's ready to pounce, right? That's waiting, right? Waiting to get you at the door. Right? And its desire is to you, right? It wants to get you. But you can rule over it, right? So this notion of seeing sin, and here maybe even more particularly this idea that we have a yetzer, right? That we have a force within us, right? This evil inclination that tempts us, right? And then we have to think of that inclination very much the way that we think of an enemy, right? Of a nefarious force that's out to get you. Now, the metaphysics of the Yetzer Hara, what exactly we mean when we say Yetzer Hara, right? Do we really see this as a like a sentient force within us, right? Or if we understand it more abstractly or more metaphorically, right? That part of our own makeup, right, is a certain tendency that pulls us, the darker sides that lurk within our own soul, is an interesting question, but I think kind of really tertiary to our purpose. It doesn't really matter, right? So it's interesting. One of the really most fascinating books ever written about the Yetzer Hara is a book written by a 20th century Christian British writer by the name of C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis wrote a series of columns that appeared in a paper in England called The Guardian. It was published as a little book called The Screwtape Letters. And Rav Lichtenstein said, if you want a Musar Sefer, right, a book of ethical guidance, you can't go wrong with the Screwtape Letters. So it's a very clever book. It's written in an almost satiric kind of way. It is a dialogue between two devils, right? Or in our language, we would call them two Yetzer Haras, right? Who are in charge of tempting human beings, right? One is the uncle, right? And one is the young, green behind the ears devil, right? And it's the letters the uncle is writing to the nephew, right? About a human being that the devil is trying to lead into sin. It's very funny. It's a very, very clever kind of book, and he's always he's giving him tips and ripping into him for anytime the guy does a mitzvah, does something positive, right? How did you let this happen? What kind of devil are you anyways? It's a really interesting book. So C.S. Lewis writes in the introduction, he says that the question of my own opinion of devils is really very minor importance for the reader, right? If you share, so it happens to be C.S. Lewis literally believed that devils existed. Right? He says, so if you share that belief, then this is an illustration of a concrete reality. But to others, they will be personifications of abstractions, and the book will be an allegory. Right? And he says it doesn't really matter, right? He says, because the point of it, right, the point of the book is not to speculate about diabolical life, but to throw light from a new angle on the life of men. And I think the same thing is true here, right? When we talk about the Milchemes HaYetzer, right, the notion of the war against the Yetzer Hara, right, the idea of seeing sin as an enemy that needs to be, confronted and dealt with, right? It doesn't really matter whether it's a metaphor or something of greater reality, right? Whatever works for you as far as that's concerned. So why is this such a pregnant symbol, right? To talk about the idea of sin as enemy. So there's a very challenging Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva. And it's a Rambam that is in certain ways strikingly beautiful, but very difficult. The Rambam says he waxes really eloquently, it's very poetic, about the power of tshuva. He says, you know what tshuva can accomplish? He says, Emesh hayazeh sanui lifnei hamakom. Yesterday, the sinner is hated by God. It's very strong medicine, right? Hated by God. Meshukatz umirochak v'toeva. Right? He's disgusting and far away and abominable, right? Vayom, and after tshuva, the same person who ahuv v'nechmad karov v'yedid, right? That the same person is transformed. Now he's beloved by God, beloved and dear and close and a friend. So it's beautiful, right? And there's the idea that that's what tshuva can do. At the same time, right, it makes the journey in many ways very difficult to embark on, right? Because if you see yourself, right, as mishukatz umirochak v'toeva, right, you see yourself as so disgusting, right? How do you climb out of that pit, right? And how do you even start, right, when you are that aware of your own shortcomings, right? So it's ironic, we have we have like a saying we throw around in our house, you need to have the coffee to drink the coffee, right? As if you're getting up, you need your coffee to start your day, right? If you haven't drunk coffee, you're inevitably going to do all kinds of silly things, right? In trying to make your coffee, spill stuff, and you take the wrong cup, and you take, the salt instead of the sugar, right? Because really, to make the coffee, you need the coffee first, right? So the same things with tshuva, right? It's like, how am I going to do tshuva, right? If I need to do tshuva, how am I going to have the energy to do tshuva? Right? I'm going to be such a sense that, like, how am I going to change this, right? Or let me concretize a little bit more, right? Let's say somebody knows, right, that I'll use the example of anger. Right? So anger, we know, Chazal talk about anger as being a profoundly negative character trait. Right? The Rambam is his language. He says that the person who gets angry, chayav einam chayim. His life is not life. Right? It's so destructive. It's so cancerous. But let's say, in other words, if somebody has an angry streak, right, and has lived with it for 15 years, for 30 years, for 60 years, for 80 years, right? And so much of their life experience, right, has been shot through with anger, right? And in the end of the day, you see yourself as an angry person, right? Maybe the people around you see you as an angry person. The idea that I can somehow, right, in other words, if that's who I am, right, I'm the angry person, I'm a shukat merucha with toeva, right? How do I break out of that? That's my identity. That's who I am, right? Shedding your identity is a very, very difficult kind of thing. So that's why I think the idea of the milchemes hayetzer, right, to be able to see our sinning, right, our desire to sin, our impulse to sin, right, to be able to externalize it, right, because that's really what the idea of seeing sin as the enemy is all about, right? It's saying that's not me, right? There's a me, right? Elokai neshama shenatata b'torahi, right? God, like there's a pure soul inside of me, right? I'm not an angry person. I'm a person that sometimes gets angry, right? And I have to work on that. I have to deal with that, right? So a very, very dear friend of mine, really my chavrusa, Rabbi Tzvi Engel, who's the Rav of Congregation Or Torah in Skokie, Illinois, showed me the other day an unbelievable piece from Rav Yitzchak Hutner, the late Rosh Hashiva of Chaim Berlin, and the Pachad Yitzchak on Yom Kippur. And he talks about what the idea of vidui, of confession, is all about, right? It's a whole like discussion when it comes to the laws of tshuva. Right? The idea that vidui is critically important. Some might say it's actually the mitzvah itself of tshuva is vidui, is the idea of this verbal expression of sin. So the question is, what's so important about that? Like, why is the confession so significant? So Rav Hutner says something to me was like unbelievable. He says, what's vidui? he says vidui, and it's why he develops this particular metaphor is a little more complicated. It's not maybe a share for another time, right? But he talks about the idea that it is as if you are vomiting the sin out of you. In other words, that until you say vidui, right, the sins that you've done in the past they're like kind of like deeply enmeshed inside you, right? But if you're able to speak it, right, if you're able to say that I sinned by doing X, what you're doing, right, is paradoxically, right, because you might think, oh, well, like I'm owning it, right? I'm admitting that this is what I did. Rav Hutner says it's really the opposite, right? I am actually, by putting it out there, I'm saying this is an action that I did. This is an issue that I'm struggling with, but it's not me, right? And then, and he says that after vidui, he says, "Hu nilcham kivayachol al mash nifrad mimenu," right? That you are fighting something that is separate from you, right? Again, vidui doesn't solve the problem, right? There's work to do. How do you not go back to it, and so on and so forth. But by being able to voice it, right, and to be able to say, my wife actually told me that this is a technique that they use sometimes with children, even older people who are trying to deal with emotional issues, of being able to externalize the emotion, right, so that it's not oh, I'm a bad person. No, I'm talking to my anger. I'm talking to my anxiety. I'm talking to my temptation, right? It's something else. So I think that is really the first element of Milchemes Hayetzer, right? The idea of, if we want to think about sin this time of year and how to deal with it, if we can externalize it, we can think of it as something that we're fighting against rather than something that's a core part of ourselves, that's an incredible strategy for being able to deal with it. So that's the first element. Right? The element of sin as enemy, it's the ability to externalize it. Number two, I don't know how many people here, I know we have a number of people who grew up in Israel. I don't know if the word is privileged, but enough people here have been in Israel during a time of war. Right? So it's again, it's a very painful and difficult experience. But there is this mood in the country, right, of a certain sense of mission, right, during a time of war, right, where all of the like million and one fractious things in Israeli society for the moment get put back on the shelf, right, and everybody's standing, right, standing all together. And look, the truth is, we'll take it from an American perspective. We're holding now, it's 20 years since 9/11. That's hard to believe. It feels like it was maybe a week or two ago, but it was 20 years ago.
9 o'clock.
What? So you remember that iconic scene on 9/11, right, where you had all of Congress singing "God Bless America" together, right? And certainly today it feels like almost a different universe. Like, I don't think Congress could agree to do anything together right now. But the idea at that moment where there is a clarity, right, of purpose, of mission at a time of war, right? And it's a clarity, right, that creates a certain kind of courage, right? So it's interesting. The Rambam codifies what it means to be a Jewish soldier in Hilchos Malachim, in the Laws of Kings. And he builds on the idea, the Torah, we read about it a week ago, talks about this idea that it does not want people who are afraid coming to war, right? It's not good for them. It's not good for anybody else, right? That fear is the antithesis of war. That war, you have to have the courage that's born out of mission. He says, when a man goes into battle, Yisha'en al mikveh Yisrael Moshio beis tzara, right? You should rely on God, right? V'lo yira, v'lo yifchad, right? You should not be afraid at all. V'lo yichashev, lo bi'ishto, v'lo b'fanav. He's not supposed to focus in that moment on his family even. Right? You're supposed to clear yourself, right? Create the Zen. Right now, what I need to do is I need to go fight. I cannot afford to be afraid, right? I need to do this, right? And that if someone doesn't do that, the stakes are very high, right? It's as if you spilled the blood of all of Israel, right? So tshuva is very frightening. Right? There's this idea that you're going to change, right? And again, and we'll come back to this in a second, there's the fear of failure, right? There's the fear of past experience, right? The idea of change is something that I think most people, right, are find unbelievably anxiety provoking, right? And it's shame and it's guilt and like there's a lot of baggage tied up with it. But if the notion, right, that we are now in a mission, right, that we are fighting, and again, especially the idea of the season, right, and the more that you experience this idea, I've spoken to get before on Yom Kippur about the power of feeling that you are part of a chabura on Yom Kippur, right? It's not just that you're by yourself, right? And that's why the shul experience is so important on Yom Kippur. Right? This idea of feeling like we're all in this together, right? That's something which is very, very powerful, right? And the idea that each of us is fighting, our own, individual struggles, but they're part of this kind of significant kind of thing that can give. There's a spirit to core, right, that takes over, right? This idea that like we're working on this together, right? This is our what's the phrase they use? We're a band of brothers, right? Working towards this common goal, right? So I think that the war, the military, the enemy metaphor is important because it allows us to externalize the enemy, right? So it's not like we're fighting against ourselves, but we're fighting against, right? We can conceptualize it outside of ourselves. Number two, being able to have that sense of courage and being mission driven. And finally, and last, is the question of strategy, right? And with this, I want to show you something incredible. Give me 1 second. It's worth seeing on the screen. Hold on. This is not the, okay. So this is another piece by Rabbi Yolkut. This is actually a letter that he wrote in 1963. Okay, so the letter, it's dated the second day of Rosh Chodesh Iyar 1963. So he's writing to a student. It's a very warm letter, right? It begins Ahuvi Chavivi, right? My dear beloved one. He says, I got your letter. He says, and you should know that you touched my heart. He says, because you should know, my dear one, that your letter itself belies the description that it contains. Why? So this is someone who writes to his Rabbi, right? And he's opening up his heart, talking about this idea that he feels that he is no longer, there's a time that he felt more religiously, spiritually, psychologically in a good place, that he uses the term that now he feels that he's had failures, right? And he is no longer shatul b'veit Hashem, right? He's no longer like a righteous person planted in God's house. He feels like a reject. So Rutgers first says something amazing. He says he thinks there's a very big problem. He calls it a deya chola, right? It's it's like a sickness almost. That when we talk about our great people, right, we talk about them as finished products, right? All we talk about is when they were absolutely perfect, right? And that we don't know about the fact that to become a great person meant these people went through inner struggles, right? So he says, and it's really, if only, he can say this, right? He says, you talk about the Chavetz Chaim, right? So the Chavetz Chaim in the first half of the 20th century, right, was, everybody agreed, right, was the righteous person amongst the Jewish people, right? And he was the great advocate against Lashon Hara, right? He was actually, in many ways, the person who put it really on the agenda. He says, everybody's impressed. He says, but do you know, and listen to the language he uses. Kol ha-milchamot ha-ma'avakim ha-michsholot ha-nefilot va-hanesigot la'achor shematzah Chavetz Chaim b'derech ha-milchama shalo im yitzro hara. He says, we don't tell the stories because we know what they are, right? Of all of the wars, the struggles, right? The pitfalls, the collapses, right? And the moves backwards that the Chavetz Chaim must have had, right? If you think the Chavetz Chaim was born, with an angel with 6 wings, you're missing the point, right? The Chavetz Chaim fought to become the Chavetz Chaim. And we have to learn with this. He says, because what happens? He says, Hatotza'ah mizeh, the result of this, he kishenar bal ruach, bal shifa, bal tsisa, right? That when you have a young man, right, who has religious desire to grow in ambitions and horizons and so forth, and finds himself in a time in life, right, where he is not winning, right? He's falling, whatever the Yetzer Hara that he's dealing with is, right, until he comes to a place where he says he's bilti shatul b'veit Hashem, right? He is no longer planted in God's house. He says, because he thinks, right, that what does it mean to be a good Jew? A good Jew means you're on this, like, you're like, a little angel playing a harp, flying in heaven somewhere, sitting on he says, al nos desha shalmei menuchos, right, on the tranquil lawns by still waters, right? And he thinks that like the righteous in Gan Eden, and if that's not what he's experiencing, right, he's like, all I'm doing is trying unsuccessfully to confront my own problems, right? I feel like I'm out of the game. He says, Dalacha, Sheshoresh nishmascha, that what you build your neshama from is not the tranquility of your good desires, but it's your struggle with Yetzer Hara, right? That's the point. And he quotes a saying in English. He says, they say lose the battle and win the war, right? To realize that it's a long game, right? In other words, that it's not, if you feel, right, that you've had falls with sin, whatever category of sin that we're talking about, that we feel that we've fallen off the wagon, maybe we've done it repeatedly, right? We've tried and tried and tried and tried, and every vidui, you come around on Yom Kippur, and last year and 5 years ago and 20 years ago, it was the same issue, and you feel like it's one step forward, 2 steps back. Rav Hutner says if you use the military metaphor, right, part of war, you're not going to win everything, right? But the goal is the long game, right? And he says if you continue to fight and you continue to struggle and you think of yourself that way, right, that's how you're going to find success. So I think that these are, and it's interesting. I'll just at the very end of the letter, right? And there's this idea of there's the end here. No, so he says, I think you are shasol v'veis Hashem, right? In other words, for all of your issues, the fact that you care about this and you pick yourself up and you try again, that's what it really means to be shasol v'veis Hashem, to be planted in God's house. So let's go over quickly, right? 3 points to take away. And again, I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning. These are metaphors, right? These are models, right? So take what works for you, right? Leave behind for now and keep it in your back pocket, right? It could be that it's not for you for this year, but for next year or 10 years ago, or it might be something that somebody else, this is the stone on the breastplate that's going to light up for them. So 3 ideas about using the metaphor of the war with sin. Number 1, the externalization, right? If you can think of sin as an enemy, right? Not me, but a separate enemy. That's something that can be very powerful and very psychologically enabling, right? In terms of being able to do this. Number 2, if you think about it as a war, you think about it as a mission, right? The mission breeds courage. Finally, this beautiful piece from Footner, right? You lose a battle, but the goal is to win the war, right? That a soldier, you lose, you pack up and you fight another day, right? And the idea that hopefully all of these will be useful for us to be l'zakos b'yom to be able to be found innocent and blessed on the day of judgment, right? As we continue in our ongoing study, we'll come back to it. Be'ez Hashem, next week we'll talk about sickness. We'll come back to that next week. Hold on a second. The book is called The Screw Tape Letters. There is a little bit of Christian imagery in it, but you just kind of skip past that part. The positive for sure totally outweighs that. And again, it's a very easy and quick read. All right, a good night to everyone. I hope to see you all even before next week, but certainly next week. And tomorrow we'll be beginning our series, the Simcha series, finding the unique Simcha of each Yontif to help us out in some somewhat anxious times that we find ourselves in. A good night to everyone.
Yeah, that's on Zoom tomorrow also.
Tomorrow, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shabbat Tov.